good evening, and welcome to another episode of the Architecture Foundation's Book Week. Over the course of this week, we're running a whole series of online events with contributions from different authors of recently published books, which have in some sense or other a relationship to architecture. And the week's going to culminate in a live event at the Art Workers Guild, where we have a series of live talks, which will also be recorded and made available on the YouTube site. But my enormous pleasure now to introduce, I think initially we're going to hear from Adrian Forty, who's one of the co-editors of Extinct, a Compendium of Obsolete Objects, recently released by Raktion Books. And Adrian, you have a kind of stellar lineup of some of the 70-odd contributors to this book who we're going to be hearing from. So I'm going to pass over to you to tell us a little about the publication and introduce tonight's speakers. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Alice. Well, hello, everyone. We're here to introduce this book, Extinct, a Compendium of Obsolete Objects. It contains 85 essays by 77 different authors, each one dealing with an object that came to a dead end for one reason or another. What we're going to do this evening is to hear from two of my co-editors who are going to describe the thinking behind the project and how we went about it. And then we're going to hear from 5 of the 77 contributors who are going to talk about individual objects. So I'm going to start by handing over to Olivia Horsfall Turner, who is one of my co-editors, and she's going to describe some of the thinking behind the project. So over to you, Olivia.
Thank you, Adrian. So Extinct, a Compendium of Obsolete Objects, originated from a kind of supernova of a research project, which was funded by HERA, the Humanities in the European Research Area, in what actually turned out to be the dying days of Britain's membership of the European Union, itself evidently regarded by some as worthy of inclusion in the book. The overarching research project was led by Mari Vatum at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design and was entitled Printing the Past: Architecture, Print Culture, and Uses of the Past in Modern Europe. Under this rubric, 4 research teams each tackled a different theme about how, during the 18th and 19th centuries, notions of the past were mediated through architecture and print. Those themes were transference, legitimization, preservation, and projection, each the focus of one team comprising a higher education institution and a collections-based museum. After Barbara and Adrian invited me to become part of the projection team, we met to discuss the scope of our strand. And our focus was to consider the ways in which images of architecture project visions of the future, constructing narratives of progress that normalize the unstable and destructive workings of capitalism. From the mid-19th century onwards, there was massive upheaval in urban centres as infrastructural projects of huge size and complexity ripped through the city's physical and social fabric. And a sense of the destabilization that this caused is conveyed by Marx and Engels' famous observation of how all fixed, fast, frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. We looked at how during this period of unsettling change, new varieties of print media played a crucial role in projecting logic and order onto the disorderly to create a narrative of reassuring progress. And alongside these grand narratives of urban and technological change, we thought as well about narratives of progress on a different scale through the finer cultural grain of objects. For in the same way that print media can conjure up the impression of logic, so too museums can project a sense of order onto the chaos of designed things. We discussed how museums construct images of the past and future through their collecting policies. For a museum to establish a narrative about the past is unsurprising. Creating one about the future is perhaps less expected, yet it's particularly pertinent to museums that have contemporary collections, as the V&A, for instance, always has done. In that context, one of the functions of the museum is to collect objects that subscribe to what we might call a narrative of future relevance. Such museums select contemporary materials, drawings, prints, photographs, media, architecture, that they consider to be exemplary, often focusing on the new and the innovative, in order to elevate contemporary public taste and improve professional practice. Through architecture and design-related acquisitions and exhibitions, these institutions project into the future, predicting certain trajectories of progress that also serve to provide a strong sense of continuity and security in the face of physical and social upheaval. But we asked ourselves, what happens when these institutions' predictions of future relevance falter and fail? What of the dead ends, the failures, the obsolete technologies, the unwanted acquisitions and the disposals? How can these be accounted for and allowed to disrupt the narratives, however comforting, of constant improvement and unerring evolution? We started thinking of these dead ends and began compiling lists of extinct objects. We defined extinct objects as objects that envisioned a particular future that either never came to pass or itself in time became history. These objects are visualizations of the future, employ novel materials and technologies, or anticipate different ways of living. They project, at the time of their creation, a confident idea of the future, but with the passing of time, their projections have proved to be unfounded, misguided, or rerouted. As a consequence, the objects are, in some ways, extinct or obsolete, the dead ends of design. But we found that their testimony to alternative possibilities, and indeed in many cases the fact that they resurrected themselves again and again, almost as undead objects, had much to reveal about our continual negotiation between past, present, and future. And we began to think that a collection of these would make for a thought-provoking alternative to a futurist manifesto. So I hope that gives you some insight into the project's genesis. Barbara is now going to talk, quite frankly, I think, about the practicalities of bringing such a complex book into being.
Thank you, Olivia. So in keeping with this evolutionary spirit, I thought I would say something about how the book's conception of extinction evolved throughout the editorial process. And as editors, we felt that in order to do justice to such a broad subject, we needed to bring together an equally broad collection of minds going beyond architectural or design history. So we cast a very wide net, and we invited a large number of scholars, curators, writers, artists, and architects, each to nominate an extinct object that intrigued them somehow, and then to write several sentences about why. And then we sat back and we looked forward to the responses. But the moment they began to come in, we saw that we had a sort of problem. That is, many of the objects that were being nominated were not truly extinct. Many were in use somewhere in the world, or were being kept lovingly alive by hobbyists or by vintage collectors. And even if obsolete, some objects, like the Zeppelin, was crowdfunded back to life very soon after we accepted it into the collection. So almost immediately, we found ourselves grappling with the realization that, as Olivia said, to enter the world of extinct objects is to enter the world of the undead. Very little expires completely. And even if extinct, objects leave traces of all kinds, whether in subsequently designed objects or in human behavior. And this realization threw us at first, though it probably shouldn't have, given that it's very much in line with the insights of scholar and extinct contributor David Edgerton. In his important book, Shock of the Old, which very much inspired us, David notes that old technologies are in use everywhere and makes the point that technologies don't advance in a smooth, linear flow. They advance in starts and stops. They frequently jump track or they loop back. So this really required that we shift focus. We became less concerned with whether an object was truly dead, and instead we asked authors to focus more on processes of extinction. Why was one type of technology promoted at the expense of another? Why were some commercial products withdrawn or never took off in the first place? Why were some designs never built? As you'll hear from our authors, even with very mundane objects, multiple factors are often at play, from health and safety laws to changing political ideologies, to the invention of new materials, to shifts in fashion. There's much more to say. I feel I've barely scratched the surface, but I would like to hand over to the authors who explore this complexity through their examples. I'd like to finish, however, by saying something about where we got to as editors with this project. In the end, for all of our continuing wariness of narratives of progress, this idea that progress is unstoppable and inevitable, we felt that the book does also reveal a more affirmative side to extinction, or at least to extinct objects. Many of our extinct objects summon up other ways of thinking, making, and interacting with the world. They serve as containers of potential and also of provocation. And above all, as Olivia said, they embody other visions of the future that still, in some ways, remain accessible to us. So over to you, Adrian.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Barbara. Well, that gives you a sense of some of the ideas and some of the problems that we ran up against in thinking about this. But let's turn now to look at some of the contributions and see the sorts of things that we found we were encouraged to think about. And in every case, what we're going to hear, it was the author's idea to pursue whatever it was that was extinct. We didn't have an agenda or a checklist of things that we thought needed to be written about. In every case, it was the author's particular obsession with this, that, or the other that led them to it. So our first contributor is Jacob Paskins, who's a lecturer in the History of Art department in UCL, and he's going to talk about the pneumatic postal system in Paris.
Okay, so I'm going to say a few words about my contribution to Extinct, which was about the pneumatic postal system. The pneumatic postal system was a network that allowed the rapid delivery of messages across a city. Letters were sent at high speed through a series of underground delivery tubes that connected local post offices, and the whole system was powered by a system of compressed air. A number of cities introduced pneumatic postal infrastructure in the second half of the 19th century, and in some cases, fully operating services ran for well over 100 years. My own interest in the pneumatic post doesn't come from first-hand experience of the service, unlike perhaps some of the very personal relationships some of the authors in this book, I think, had with their own objects. And I think we'll probably learn a bit more about that from today's other speakers. Well, most of my own knowledge of the pneumatic post actually came from references in stories and in films, in particular in French cinema. And that's why I came to focus on the Paris system in particular in my contribution to the book. The pneumatic post became an integral part of everyday life in Paris from the 1860s right up to the early 1980s. It has left considerable cultural traces, and like many new technologies, it introduced new vocabulary to everyday speech. And this was once ubiquitous, but I think is now quite meaningless, especially some of the vocabulary associated with the pneumatic post, such as un petit bleu, the name of the special stationery that was used for pneumatic messages in its first decades. And despite the prominent role the pneumatic post played in everyday life, the infrastructure of the pneumatic post was actually quite invisible, as the main delivery pipes were routed through Paris's famous sewer system. So when the postal service ended, there was no physical changes to the city per se. Although the pneumatic post was operated by the telegraph division of the post office, pneumatique were certainly not telegrams. They were physical letters that were sent at high speed through a system of delivery tubes. And in this photograph we see on the screen, you can see the way the service operated. The caps, thanks to these capsules that were thrust through the system. And each capsule could take up to 5 individual letters that were rolled up. Now, working on the pneumatic post was really following a military-like regimentation, I think, to ensure the millions of letters that were delivered each month to reach their correct destination at high speed. A worker in the pneumatic post would, first of all, have to sort the letters according to destination. The letters would then be loaded into these capsules. Then operatives would have to fit a series of metallic bands to indicate the route that the capsules had to take through the system. So it was a sort of electromagnetic routing system. The operatives also had to maintain the system of pressurized air pipes and also check for unexpected loss in air pressure, which might indicate a blockage in the system. Now, in my contribution to Extinct, I have written a bit about why the pneumatic post enjoyed such a success for many years. I think it was about the incredibly useful and reliable way of sending messages very rapidly across the city without the need for clogging streets up with delivery vehicles. I was also amused in my research to learn that today's problem of sending an email or message too quickly and then regretting it is nothing new. And this was very much a symptom of using the pneumatic post. So in my text, I describe a short film by Jean-Luc Godard that demonstrated the perils of sending things in haste. We learn that the pneumatic post in Paris could be quicker than taking a bus ride across Paris. So in the film, when a woman thinks she's mixed up two pneumatic letters that were destined for two different lovers, she attempts and fails to intercept the letter that she sent too quickly by jumping on a bus. So the post got there much quicker than she could in person. Now, I learnt only after this book came out a few weeks ago that my grandparents courted by sending messages through the pneumatic post. And I think it's amazing to think that a system that was so part of the everyday culture of a city is, to today's present eyes, both technologically antiquated in the way it relied on steam pumps and tubes to deliver messages, but also at the same time, still ultra modern. I think a pneumatic postal system today seems impossibly futuristic. And I wonder if we will ever see anything like it again. Imagine just how popular this would be today when we wait impatiently at home for books, clothes, or food to be delivered. What if we could deliver all of this through a system of underground pipes that could help clear our congested streets? Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Jacob. And we move on now from one transit system to another. I'm going to invite Gillian Darley, who's an independent author and critic, to talk about the overhead railway for a new town in Buckinghamshire, nicknamed Paulieville, the North Bucks new town. Gillian, over to you.
There I am. Are you picking me up?
Yeah, we've got you.
Okay, I can see you, but not me. Paulieville, or to give it the formal title, North Bucks Monorail City. I was thinking actually how neatly it followed the pneumatic postal system as Jacob was talking, because in its glorious form, and here on the screen you see Bill Barrett's evocation of a sort of from the flight deck, as it were. I don't know quite what you would call the front of a suspended vehicle, but you're looking to the left, you can see the steering wheel and the dials and so on, and it is heading from a pod outside town into the centre of the town. Bill Barrett was in fact the right-hand man of Fred Pooley, and Fred Pooley was one of that extraordinary generation of architect planners of the wartime and post-war period, who could sort of really see no limits in many different aspects of their activities. And in the case of Pooley, Buckinghamshire was earmarked for a massive expansion of some sort. Pooley decided and said to Barrett, who clearly had an extraordinary eye and as a draftsman here, would he like to consider the implications of building a new city for 250,000 people? I mean, it's the kind of thing you get asked every day, isn't it? At which point, Pooley goes on holiday. This is 1962. And Barrett is advised to go into a locked room and to start thinking about this city for 250,000 people, which he does, it would seem, with very good grace. Barrett and Pooley had done and were to continue to do quite a lot of research into monorails. They'd been to Wuppertal to see the very famous 1901 and still functioning line. And obviously the various expos were using this kind of transport in modified forms, airports similarly. There was something in the wind, something immensely forward-looking. And I think it's important to kind of put it beside what was actually going on in the New Towns programme, which was a truly extraordinary venture, but it was very tame. And so Paulieville's real objective was to shake everybody up. Enough of Harlow, enough of Stevenage. This is the future. And they dreamt up between them this truly extraordinary plan for a lobed sort of butterfly form. It's hard to describe on the left there. It's I think that's the best way of describing it, a kind of butterfly with pods along it, which would be self-contained small housing areas, given, I suppose, very much as in the existing Newtown programme to particular architects, and then laced together by a continually running transport system, which was free. People went to a point, they caught their transport and went into town, whether they were going shopping, to the hospital, to school, to college, or whatever it might be. And of course, there were vehicles in the picture, but they don't appear. The artwork, the images has very little to do with conventional transport. So Barrett had spent no more than a couple of weeks working away on this, and presumably Paulieville was immensely encouraged, because he did two things. One was that he moved Barrett and himself over the road to the county council headquarters, where the doors were shut even more firmly, and they proceeded to develop this idea. The doors were shut because there were quite a lot of other people, big fish, in the pond, thinking about how to develop Buckinghamshire into a large centre of population. Nobody really knew what was going on in Paulieville's mind, and those closed doors made sure that nobody saw what was afoot. And effectively, from 62 to 64, it developed. But it, as time went on, it hit. We were talking about the idea of, political obstruction, all the different things that overturn some of these wonderful ideas, which cause them to become extinct. Richard Crossman really was the obstacle in the way of this, as well as the thoughts of Buckinghamshire people. Farmers didn't get their compensation. Council was worried about tenure and ownership of housing. It all began to sort of spin into a kind of confusion once the doors had opened and people began to see what was afoot. And I mean, my own interest in this is, I'm very interested in the idea of different versions of planned settlement, from the very small and modest and sometimes very high-minded onwards. And but particularly this came to me because I was working on Ian Nairn a few years ago, and Ian Nairn thought that Fred Paulieville was a sort of just a model of a visionary man within the field of architecture and planning, architect planner as such. And Nairn wrote up this scheme in the Observer, gave it a huge blast of publicity, and continued to support Paulieville's ventures. This was quickly known as Paulieville, but he went on as the chief planner for some years and always had Ian Nairn's support. But it dwindled. It was under attack. And I think what's so impressive about this little story is that they carried on. I mean, even in the teeth of government disapproval, as I say, Richard Crossman and his formidable civil servant, Evelyn Sharp, but so many reasons why it wasn't going to get traction and essentially finance. And yet on they went. And for some years, Paulieville was really indomitable on it, and Barrett likewise. And then came a moment, I think it's about 1967, that Barrett must have just seen the writing on the wall. And what does he become? He becomes the chief architect planner of Milton Keynes. That's the end. It becomes Milton Keynes, but it's very earthbound. So in this form, it is entirely extinct.
Great. Thank you very much, Gillian. An extraordinary story of a dream that never happened. Well, for our next contribution, we move now from the very large infrastructural system down to something very small. And to talk about FisherPrice Peg figures, we have Mark Morris from the Architectural Association in London. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Adrian. Ostensibly, my contribution to Extinct was about these figures. And I beg of the reader, if they remembered growing up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they might remember their touch or the whiff of the ponderosa pine that they're turned from, or indeed their taste if they happen to put these toys in their mouth. They're about the same size as a champagne cork, to give you a sense of scale. And they were originally pegs. Pegs meant to fit in one of the earliest toys from the FisherPrice company, which was a school bus. FisherPrice company was founded in the 1930s in Aurora, New York, near where I used to live in upstate. And it was founded by Herman Fisher, Helen Schell, Irving Price, and his wife, the noted children's book illustrator, Margaret Evans Price. And it's Margaret who really makes the story for me. It's interesting, these figures, because they're so simplified. They're not really figures at all. They have no operable limbs, etc. But they play a certain game in this world of Fisher-Price. As I say, begun with these vehicles, but round about 1969, famously, they find a home. And it's a sort of all-American home. And these toys were beautifully made. They came out of a woodcraft tradition of toy making pre-war. And as you know, all these years on, things like the doorbell still works. But the figures inhabited a world that's a little incongruous. By that, I mean, their furniture is sort of reductive and strange. It's sort of world of plastic and these sort of bucket seats to allow the peg figures to slot in. Likewise, things like bunk beds are rather reducible. But Margaret's lithographic decals are something else entirely. They make the toy. And it's really this world of the interiors where Margaret's ideas of what was fashionable in the 70s in terms of interior design, living room, children's bedroom, etc., up through the elevations of the interior, a whole other world, not to mention the exterior. So that the space of these really reductive toys, nothing in the tradition of a beautifully crafted dollhouse, but rather sort of brutish figures and bits of furniture. They live in these worlds that, through their illustration, tend to tell some interesting tales and allow for projection, I suppose, around the player. Now, it's interesting that FisherPrice were always gender neutral in terms of their advertising, and always had a sort of wide range of appropriate ages that should be playing with their toys. This approach went on for the better part of 20, 30 years. 5 years on from the introduction of the house, that incongruity began to be reckoned with in the much loved A-frame of 1976. What the A-frame did, it took the illustrations, but it began to allow for more sort of specificity in the interior. And you can see how these toys would have been interesting to any architect to be. It's all about really how these things are put together. But here you see that the world of the sort of two-dimensional pure decal is now overtaken by some modeling of things like kitchen or things like hearth, operable doors rather than decals. And again, another in good working order doorbell. But importantly, things like the stairwell are still rather reductive. What started to happen as FisherPrice became more and more popular, there was an explosion of sort of typologies that were being produced, and Margaret Evans still keeping up, still doing all the illustration. At its zenith, it was producing things like the FisherPrice family toy Castle, which is a real marvelous thing. And it was all about finding trapdoors, sliding hidden rooms. And indeed, these toys were remarkably successful and long-lived. As I say, they were made sturdily. They would last for a generation or two. People would pass them on to younger siblings or grandchildren. FisherPrice would occasionally tweak a design. The house, originally a Dutch colonial, would become a Tudor house later on. All was going so well until about 1986, when Edward Schwartz published a sensational book, Toys That Kill. And it was a warning to parents to beware of certain toys that might be a health and safety risk for their children. Unfortunately for FisherPrice Company, on the very cover of Toys That Kill, the only illustrated toy was indeed the figures from the FisherPrice play sets. This immediately caused problems for the company overnight. It was so important to Schwartz to highlight the dangers represented by the peg figures in terms of being a swallowing hazard, a choking hazard, that he included illustrations for a special Heimlich maneuver just to remove one of these peg figures from someone's throat. What happens next? FisherPrice by that point had sold up to Quaker Oats Company, of all things, and Quaker Oats immediately decided to discontinue the peg figures, and in turn invented something like the chunky figure, which is about 3 times the diameter of the peg figure. So everything became unbelievably squat, and the architectural interest of the toys started to decline. By the time the Mattel company picks up the toy line, they remove these figures altogether in favor of squishy rubber-like figures that in no way could be put in any child's mouth. By that point in time, of course, the decals, the architectural interest were generations back, and something like the peg figures faded into oblivion. But so too, and I think this is the real regret, did these architectural toys, because there was something about the FisherPrice line that allowed boys and girls to take an interest in typologies like the castle or the house. Later, there would be commercial tie-ins with Sesame Street or McDonald's restaurants, etc. All of these modeled, all relative to the same scale. And you could create whole communities out of FisherPrice. And that was ultimately the great fun of everyone rallying around and coming together to play. Different play sets could come together and make new cities. So it was a spectacular toy that seemed to have a demise wrapped around one fatal moment of publishing. And I think I wanted to bring this forward to talk about how something as sweet and simplified as a peg figure could unravel a great toy company that had seen a long life and is still much loved, but you cannot purchase them anywhere. They are still extinct, but I think they're still hanging out in many a nursery, attic, or basement. But FisherPrice peg figures and FisherPrice architecture gone the way of the dodo. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. It's a wonderful story, extraordinary. Thank you. For our next speaker, we're going to move to a piece of domestic apparatus, now extinct. Our speaker is Tim Anstey, who's a professor in the School of Architecture in Oslo. Are you there, Tim?
I am. I hope. Can you hear me?
Great. Yes, we can hear you.
I've been sitting here worrying about the prospect of having takeaway food delivered via the vacuum postal system. This is something really uncomfortable. But I was thinking that the FisherPrice toy, on the other hand, the peg figure, would be the perfect object. Okay, this is really a piece of family history encountered through one kind of opening, the serving hatch. I have to admit, hello? Do you hear me? We're all good?
Okay, carry on, Tim.
I have to admit, I feel this is very simplified. So in the interest of keeping to 5 minutes, I think some of the details have been cut out, but I will tell you what I have here. So a piece of family history played out from an encounter with one kind of opening, the serving hatch. My Uncle John and Auntie Joan lived in a house called Kennet in Church Crookham, Hants. Bought new in 1965, its kitchen and dining room were separated functionally and aesthetically, the one in powder blue formica, the other with upholstered chairs and brocade curtains. On the wall between the two was a little opening. In the dining room, it floated, framed on the green and gold patterned wallpaper like a too low hung picture. Why was it so popular, this little window? 1960s homes contained contradictory technologies. John and Joan had a gas stove with the latest cutting edge gadget, an eye-level grill. This fed particles of fat and smoke directly into the upper atmosphere of their kitchen from where it spread via any open door through the house as a whole. They also considered another new invention as well, wall-to-wall carpet. Pioneered at the end of the 1950s, fitted carpet created a whole new sensation of domestic comfort in the home, but it was particularly allergic to fat. Stuck to the floor, it couldn't be removed for cleaning. What did this juxtaposition of technologies need? A serving hatch between dining room and kitchen, located at a height that made passing plates easy, but which restricted air exchange. That arrangement was produced during the 1960s. Serving hatches became less popular in the 1970s. Hiding housework behind a hatch hardly spoke to a progressive idea of family life, and technologies were changing. Family history again. In 1972, my parents bought a house new to us, but dating from the 1930s, called perhaps inevitably Wind Ways. Modernizing now meant knocking down the division between cooking and eating. The kitchen they installed was dominated by formica, purple, white, and wood effect, where John and Jones had been powder blue. But above the new electric stove, instead of an eye-level grill, sat a charcoal filter recirculating 2-speed Electrolux cooker hood. In our kitchen, airborne fat was captured before it could contaminate other surfaces. And this allowed soft furnishings to enter the room. The dinette, we inevitably had a dinette, was upholstered in a wild Marimekko paisley. The windows had curtains matching its surprising pattern. The requirement for a near hermetic seal between cooking and dining had dissolved. Serving hatches weren't an exclusively British phenomenon, but in order to bloom, they required a mixture of environmental conditions more prevalent in Britain than elsewhere. I'm speaking to you now from my kitchen in Stockholm. In Scandinavia, where domestic wall-to-wall carpeting never caught on, neither did serving hatches. Here too, we greeted the arrival of the cooker hood with relief, but its arrival didn't change anything about the relation between cooking and eating. Swedish kitchens had matplatser, integrated dining rooms, from the 1930s. The next generation of my English connections, my nephew Max and his wife Emma, just found an example at number 1 Shawfield Way, Milford-on-Sea, which is where this picture is taken. They put their Alexa in it, which means that with the doors open, they can shout instructions from the kitchen or the living room. Except for this, in terms of function, it's a fossil. That's it.
Well, that's a great story. Thank you very much, Tim. That's very nice. Right, for our final speaker, Cath Slessor, who's a journalist and writer on architecture, is going to introduce this strange object. Cathy. Are you there?
Hello. Well, what you see before you is actually an ashtray, believe it or not. And I'm not going to tell you who designed it because that's would be telling, and but it will become clear in the fullness of time when I give my little spiel. So I'm going to start at home in the domestic sphere, in my home in Aberdeen growing up. And my mother possessed a superlative ashtray. Mounted on a waist-high stand, it took the form of a chrome-plated bowl with a gridded lid. Faintly reeking, it stood to attention in a 1960s suburban living room like some engorged trophy ready to swing into action at the flick of a lighter. Beyond its role as passive receptacle, its heft hinted at a more nefarious purpose. You could probably have bludgeoned someone to death with it. My mother smoked, as everyone did back then, her poison of choice being Benson and Hedges. The lustrous gold of the B&H packs neatly counterpointed the silver gleam of the chrome. Not only suggestively glamorous, the ashtray was also eminently functional, concealing unsightly butts in its bowl. Like many smokers' requisites, cigarette holders, lighters, cigarette cases, its design conspired to dignify the fugitive, messy act of smoking. I still have that ashtray, emblematic of a particular time and atmosphere. Like a chrome-plated Madeleine, it seemed too majestic to discard, although in a measure of the socio-cultural distance travelled between then and now, it is never used. Instead, it forms part of my personal museum of the ashtray, joining a dozen or so specimens smuggled out of restaurants and bars over the years that stand in mute testament to simpler times and less healthful pleasures. While the history of tobacco and smoking is well documented, the ashtray is a more obscure object of art and desire. It started life as the quotidian ashpan that first accompanied the introduction of tobacco from the New World to Europe in the late 15th century. While rudimentary versions of ashtrays existed before the modern era, the idea of a consciously designed objet de délice started to gain ground only in the early 20th century as more women took up smoking. Form and ornamentation became more considered as the ashtray moved from the public realm into the domestic sphere as part of a progressive modern lifestyle. Art Nouveau and Art Deco proved especially fertile stylistic terrain, and inevitably artists and architects also got in on the act. In 1967, Salvador Dali devised a limited edition ashtray in Limoges porcelain for Air India as a squiggle of a serpent and some contorted swans wrapped around a shell. And this is the thing that you can see here. As payment, he requested a baby elephant, which Air India duly transported from Bangalore to Spain. Less flamboyantly, the Danish polymath Arne Jacobsen designed a classic mid-century modernist version in the form of a laconic stainless steel hemisphere that tipped up to disgorge and conceal the butts in the body of the ashtray, thus keeping everything Nordically neat. Jacobsen also designed a hearse, so he might have been said to have astutely hedged his bets. The ashtray became something of a coveted souvenir. When Quaglino's, the society restaurant in St. James's, was taken over by the gourmand restaurateur Terence Conran in the 1990s, 25,000 of the establishment's distinctive Q-shaped metal ashtrays were appropriated by light-fingered diners over the course of a decade. That's an average of 7 per day. This should come as no surprise, since a well-turned ashtray is not just a quotidian object, but often a thing of curious beauty, invested with sentimental significance. It is the memento of that meal, that drink, that place, that time, that person, that occasion. Famously, people used to nick the ashtrays from Concorde when you could still smoke on planes. During his tenure at Mirabelle Restaurant in Mayfair, Marco Pierre White, the once enfant terrible of haute cuisine, printed the terse injunction, property of Marco Pierre White, on the bottom of his signature fish-shaped ashtrays, to no avail. As White's experience showed, it does not pay to provide patrons with nice things. Better to go cheap and dirty, as generations of pub landlords instinctively grasped. Worlds away from the fripperies of hand-blown Murano glass, the heavy glass ashtray bulging with butts was a familiar yet gruesome staple of English hostelries. Being cleanable and durable, glass makes an especially effective ash receiver. Plastic, by contrast, is apt to burn and stain, as anyone who has attempted to stub out their cigarettes in a yellow Ricard triangle, a fixture of French cafes, will testify. From its heady days of pomp and plenitude, adorning every restaurant table, every bar counter, and every living room sideboard, the ashtray has today atrophied to a grubby metal maul tacked outside offices, where shivering die-hard smokers congregate fitfully for conspiratorial drags during their allotted screen breaks. No longer standing sentinel at the nation's lunches and cocktail hours, or coming as standard in cars, trains, and planes, the ashtray is en route to extinction. In the Anglo-American world, at least, collateral damage in the UK's ban from 2007 on smoking in enclosed indoor spaces. Alternatives, such as vaping, have come to some extent to fill the void, spawning their own range of kit and associated paraphernalia. Cigars still endure among a certain type of tycoon, requiring specialized ashtrays to keep the glowing cigar butt perfectly horizontal so that it will burn. Beyond humidor connoisseurship lies the more chaotic terrain of the pot smoker, who will always need a blaze to ash, as marijuana websites helpfully put it. Yet for all this, the direction of travel is clear. The ashtray has moved from status symbol to an object of secrecy, shame, and subterfuge. Because, of course, the ashtray is not only an adjunct to social pleasure, but a memento mori, a reminder that you are dancing with death. The World Health Organization cites smoking tobacco as the world's single greatest preventable cause of death, and it is still the leading killer in the developed world. A smiling assassin invited to your table, insistently hovering. Like a delusional Norma Desmond frozen in a spotlight of her imagining, the ashtray is not destined for miraculous comeback. It bestrode the 20th century as quotidian as a cruet set. Today it skulks in the well-ordered cupboards of ironists and fetishists. The day may come when, if you produce one, people will genuinely be bemused as to its function. Perhaps it was never that essential anyway. The American actor John Goodman recalls the advice he received from the legendary bon fumeur Peter O'Toole when the two men were filming together in 1991. During a break, Goodman asked to borrow an ashtray. O'Toole, with characteristic insouciance, flicked his ash on the floor and declared, "Make the world your ashtray, my boy." Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Cathy. Well, what a disparate range of objects we've got here. Some of them so everyday, so commonplace, and have been part of our everyday landscape. Other things that were only dreamt of and never came into existence. And you can see, in a way, how in a way we struggled with this extraordinary, diversity of things. And in a way, that's one of the charms of the book, I think, is that we have such an odd collection of things. I can only encourage readers to pick it up and explore it for more of them. Just to end, I don't know if any of the speakers would like to add anything, or, any thoughts about the scope of the project. It's all encouraged us to go and look in our cupboards, dig out those secret collections of things that we've hung on to that we thought might one day become interesting. This has been their moment. Any contributions from, any thoughts from hearing the range of speakers?
My only thought is I think actually the postal system for books is another thing which is now more or less extinct, at least in Scandinavia. I'm longing to see the book, but sending books from one country to another to be something which is very difficult to do. So looking forward in hope. And that's another.
Okay, right. Right. We discovered another almost extinct object today, which is the landline. When Barbara tried to phone me and said she couldn't remember her own phone number because she used it so rarely. So every day, we encounter these things, and in a way, maybe our generation has seen more extinctions than any other before it. The rate of innovation has been so fast that we've possibly encountered more than any other. Any other thoughts from the assembled group?
Just to recollect the range of the extinctions and the authors, in my case, but it also in Tim's and Kathy's, it seems to be a recollection of childhood, that these things went extinct in our own lifetimes in most cases. Jacob's a bit earlier, but I think it's an interesting personal history, actually, when you walk through all these things and how many of them are caught up in decades not too far back, and how that starts to sort. So it seemed to tap people's deepest wells, and it was really an interesting index in that sense.
Yeah. Well, I hope you agree that it's fascinating, actually, seeing what people have come up with. And there are some pretty strange things in there, I have to say. Some you would never have dreamt of, even if they've been presented to you as, if they'd ever been presented to you. Well, to conclude then, I'd like to once again recommend the book to you. It's available from Raktion Books for the price of £29. But if you buy it from their website before the 1st of December, it's available at a 40% discount, which is around about £17.50. So thank you all very much for joining us this evening. Goodbye.
Bye.